Hey, I'm Jesse. We're in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. Paul has just begun to catalog the sufferings he's endured. He points to all of these as trophies, testifying to the legitimacy of his gospel ministry. That's a cool way to view your sufferings, isn't it? I think so. Because you've endured this as you bear the name of Christ, it becomes another trophy. It becomes another testimony, another proof of your devotion to the gospel. And in Paul's original intent, your love for the church of Corinth. These super apostles had never been beaten. They never had suffered the 40 lashes minus one. They never been beaten with rods. They never been stoned nearly to death. They hadn't endured a fraction of what Paul had. Paul's testimony and calling as an apostle cost him everything. Do you hear me? New Christian? It costs you everything. Here's Paul in chapter 11, verse 25. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I received a stoning. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I have spent a night and a day in the open sea. We've seen Paul's beatings elsewhere in scripture, in Philippi, in Acts chapter 16, verse 22. That's one of the beatings that he's talking about. The stoning occurred in Lystra. That's where he would meet Timothy later on, in Acts chapter 14, verse 19. And then he's shipwrecked numerous times, and one of those shipwrecks occurs in Acts chapter 27. So as he catalogs these, the story checks out. Look at Acts chapter 14, chapter 16, chapter 27 for 3 examples of exactly the kind of sufferings that he's cataloging here. Wow, that's a gospel testimony. And wow, that's an incredible way to totally reframe your own sufferings. I mean, like, we make horror movies about people who are stuck out at sea, in the open sea, for a night and a day. And Paul had been through that. Paul had been through that himself. Like, he'd lived through horror movies. All right, he'd been beaten with rods. He'd been stoned, all right, and not in the Washington State way, in a very bad way, very painful way. And on 3 different occasions he was shipwrecked. Now, how many times have you been shipwrecked for the gospel? I haven't had one shipwreck yet for the gospel. Like, all of the ships that I've been on have been intact. I feel way less cool compared to Paul. And I'm blown away by the way that he views his own sufferings, the way that he views his own trials. I don't know if at the moment while he was floating on a piece of driftwood in the open sea all night and all day, if you were to tell him, like, hey, what's your attitude toward this right now, Paul? He'd be like, well, Jesse, I'm pretty stoked about how this is going to add to my gospel testimony. Like, in the moment, it probably wasn't too fun. But he's now using it as a further piece of evidence to testify to the legitimacy of his apostolic authority and calling. Man, what if we all viewed our sufferings the same way? This is an opportunity for my faith to be proven genuine. This is a testing of my devotion to the gospel calling, and it will become a part of my story. It will actually increase my credibility. It's not fun at the time, but afterwards you get to do like Paul. When you're pressed, all right, your resume, you can add to it. You can explain this suffering as another chapter. It'll be another one of those bullet points on your resume. I've been stoned nearly to death. I've been beaten with rods 3 times. I've been shipwrecked 3 times. It's been a night and day in the open sea. That's how he views his trials and difficulties. They just all add to his legitimacy. So you're either currently a Christian. This is not a prophecy, all right? Like, you're either just getting out of a trial and difficulty, or you're awaiting another one. That's where all of us are. We're all either coming out of a trial, maybe in the middle of one, or we're facing another one. Let it be a foregone conclusion that this will just add to your Christian resume, that this new suffering, this new trial, this new difficulty will only add to your credibility. That testing of faith, aced it. That testing of my faith, flying colors. All of these things are chapters in my story now. What the enemy intended for evil, God will use for beautiful good.